In this movie, we're going to look at one final concept before we sink our teeth into expressions, and that is variables. Now, in the last movie, we looked at using a one-dimensional array, like opacity, and putting it into a two-dimensional array as one dimension of that array. But what happens when we try to link them as is without specifying a particular dimension of the array? Go ahead and option-click on Scale for the ring layer, and I'm going to drag the pick whip. Keep in mind this is a one-dimensional array to opacity, which only has one value. Now, if we click to accept that, we'll see a whole bunch of confusing gibberish. And really, it's not a whole bunch of confusing gibberish. Really, what has happened here is that After Effects has created something called a variable. Now, just like you learned in middle school or high school algebra, a variable can be anything. That's what a variable means. The way that we create variables in After Effects is by typing the name of the variable, and here After Effects has chosen to create a variable called temp, and then you put an equal sign, and then you put what the variable means. Here they've also added a semicolon to show the end of the line. Now, after defining the variable as the opacity of the background layer, it then creates a two-dimensional array, one for each dimension of scale. And it just says temp temp. In other words, use opacity for X scale and use opacity for Y scale. Let's go ahead and make an expression for opacity, and we'll just call this anything we want. I'll call it Mr. Fancy Pants. And then we could type space equals, and let's just say 50. So then we could just go ahead and hit return to drop down the next line, because all we've done so far is to define the variable. So we have the name of the variable, equals, and then whatever we want the value to be. In my case, I'm just giving it a numeric value for simplicity's sake, but as you can see here, you could type a regular expression in there. Then I'm going to come down to the next line, and we're just going to type in Mr. Fancy Pants and hit enter. So basically, the first line defines the variable. The next line says what to use for opacity. So use Mr. Fancy Pants for opacity. And of course, we've given Mr. Fancy Pants a value of 50, and so that's why the opacity here is 50. And as you can see, scale is also being driven by the opacity, which has been driven by Mr. Fancy Pants. Now, likewise, we could come over here and say Mr. Fancy Pants minus 5, and then hit enter. And now we have 45% as the value for opacity, and also the value for X and Y scale. Now, variables are something you see a lot in expressions, and oftentimes those with experience in coding in other languages will type var first, just so they know that that is a variable. And at this point, you might be asking, well, why would you want to do variables? Why wouldn't you just type in the same thing? If this is what temp is, why wouldn't you just type that twice? Well, the thing is when you start getting into any kind of programming language, there's a lot of text. And just like naming your layers in Photoshop or After Effects, it's one of those things that doesn't seem that necessary at first. But once you start getting a big project that's very complex, then you'll really wish that you would have named your layers correctly. Or worse yet, if you would pass that file off to someone else who wasn't in your head, they don't know what every single layer is. So you've got to name your layer as well. Well, the same thing with variables. Probably why a variable like Mr. Fancy Pants wouldn't actually work well in the real world. We'd probably call this something like BKG for background opacity. And then we could use this expression, type in BKG opacity with the camel case and everything. So that way it's a little bit more descriptive. Oops, actually probably want to make that 50. Type in a 0 there. So at the end of the day then, using variables essentially is just good housekeeping. It's a way for you to organize your expressions so that future you understands what the present you is doing. And also so if you ever pass the project off to someone else, they can see what you are doing as well.